to the first installment of the Junior Fellow Lecture Series of this year. It's wonderful to see so many people here, and it seems like everyone here has availed themselves to the bar. Is that going down well? Is that suiting everyone? It's 200 up first. Okay, I assume that's a good time. So our three speakers this evening will be Sandy Lockhart, Clara Steinhagen, and Michel Boutelier, and they will be sharing their thoughts on the subject of mistakes were made. Sandy is a student in the law faculty, and I believe he'll be discussing mistakes were made as applies to the overlap between law and health. Clara Steinhagen studies history of science, and she'll be sort of looking at mistakes were made in terms of interpretations of converting the scientific knowledge of the time into health outcomes. And Michel Boutelier is also a student in law, and from what I understand, he's interested in responsibility to protect a subject for which I'm sure we can find many mistakes that have been made over time. So, Sandy will be our first speaker.
Thank you. Yeah, so that is the full introduction. Essentially what I'd like to talk about is the law surrounding HIV non-disclosure and a few of the Supreme Court of Canada rulings therein. Before I delve into it, I think I am obliged to say things like, I am a law student, I am not a lawyer, I do not hold myself out as one. All of this is just legal information. If you or anyone you know needs legal advice, I urge you to consult a lawyer. The flip side is that HIV non-disclosure is treated within an area of the law, sexual assault. And in this room, there are survivors of sexual assault and violent crime. I am one. And so for all of the flippant comments you will hear me say, some of that is a defense mechanism, but none of it is meant to make light of what is actually a real problem in our society. It is a gender defense, so I will inevitably slip into the she is the complainant or the victim and he is the accused. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that there were 21,000 sexual assaults complaints filed with the police last year, and estimates suggest that upwards of 90% of all sexual assaults are not brought to the attention of the police. So that raises that number quite substantially. As I said, HIV non-disclosure is based on sexual assault. For better or for worse, this is the way that we have chosen to address this particular problem within our society. And so before we get very far, that requires me to go through what a sexual assault is. An assault is generally the intentional application of force with the absence of consent. But at the same time, criminal law requires the offender to actually intend that application of force. It's not enough that it be accidental. It's not enough that it merely be reckless. It actually has to be an intent or some other various technical things that lawyers love. And the offender actually has to know that there was an absence of that consent. The only thing that makes it sexual is, in short, that the act was objectively sexual in nature. And so, through a fairly convoluted process, we get to sexual assault when partner A is HIV positive and partner B is not. And partner B is not told that partner A is HIV positive. And I will go through more of this in detail, but at its core, it's deemed to be fraud. And so the consent that partner B would have given is invalid. In order to get there, we have to go through one more step. And this is where the mistakes start coming in, and they just keep repeating. The law distinguishes between a mistake of fact and a mistake of law. A mistake of law is an impermissible mistake that the criminal code does not let you make. You're not allowed to say, I didn't know it was illegal to murder someone. We just know that we impute the knowledge of the law to you. There are really good policy reasons for that. Mostly, we don't like people saying, I didn't know it was illegal to murder someone. But it is punitive, in part because from cradle to grave, you are governed by laws and regulations, and you are assumed to know all of them. As opposed to a mistake of fact, where if you are in fact wrong about a mistake of fact that is integral to the crime itself, that is a complete defense. And I think the easiest way to explain this is if what makes up a knife as a switchblade is that it can be opened with one hand, if you don't know that the knife can be opened with one hand, you haven't actually, the Crown will not be able to make out the offense against you because you don't know that it's a weapon. The better example that's less often in the case law is if you're holding a bag of shredded oregano and it actually turns out to be marijuana, but all you think it is shredded oregano, you are still not guilty of possession. This comes in stark contrast to a mistake of law, where if the mistake is in fact about whether or not the law existed, then we still hold you guilty. So the classic example is the fellow who is found with the crossbow thinks that there is an exemption for antique crossbows. There is no exception for antique crossbows in the criminal code. He is still guilty of possessing a crossbow because he knew it was a crossbow. So now we get to apply this back to sexual assault, and we get some pretty horrific situations. A mistake of law is, I thought she consented, but she was 15. 15-year-olds are below the age of consent. They are not permitted to consent at law. No matter how much they say yes, that means no. If the complainant is intoxicated, they cannot lawfully consent as well. Similarly, if they are unconscious. And this is where the last one comes in about, she did not ask me about my HIV status, and so I did not disclose that I was a person living with HIV. We did not wear a condom, and or I do not have a viral load. That is where I hope to take you in the next, I'm saying, 10 minutes. Conversely, a statement that I thought she consented to the sex in question is in fact a valid defense, even if you are wrong. This is in order to protect the morally innocent. The idea behind that is that if you truly believe that there was in fact consent, that you are not, by any means of the imagination, a rapist, even though a rape did in fact occur. It's a narrow line, and it's not a fun line, but it's a line that we insist on drawing in order to protect the people who do have reasonable mistakes. Consent is, at its core, subjectively assessed in the mind of the complainant. That is to say that no matter what you think about whether or not there is consent, the only person who we can ask about consent is the complainant. It is her opinion of the situation that matters. And then again, there's that list of things where sometimes the law will take away. And no matter what your opinion is on whether or not you had consent or whether or not the complainant in fact consented, you are still guilty of sexual assault. And then there's some really weird ones in the criminal code that I like to highlight. For example, you cannot have someone else express your consent. There's some real weird things about our criminal code, and this is high on the list, all of sexual assault. So this comes back to fraud. Fraud is one of these areas where we take your consent away from you. And fraud, as the court has grown to understand it in this case, is a dishonest act coupled with a deprivation. You have to know the facts that give rise to the dishonest act, but you don't actually need to subjectively appreciate the deprivation. The deprivation is assessed as a mistake of law by the court. They just deem that to have been a deprivation. And so some of this is designed to protect all of the bar activity. So lying about being a doctor is not fraud. But, however, apparently, according to the case law, telling them that you are your twin brother, that will make out fraud. I wish I were joking, this has all happened. And I think the policy rationale is essentially that we don't want to incarcerate everybody who goes to a bar on a Saturday night. So the next question becomes, what is deprivation? And deprivation, according to the court, is a significant risk of serious bodily harm. Don't ask me how the twins fit into that. That, I believe, is 150 years old. And according to the court, the risk, the calculus that they use is, it's informed by the likelihood of the transmission of the disease and the seriousness of the disease. So all of these are ex post facto, and one of the fun quirks about the court is that they are about 10 years behind the time in terms of their jurisprudence by the time it actually gets to them. The science is all old, it gets put on appeal, and then it gets put on appeal again, and that can take anywhere from 4 to 10 years. In the context of HIV disclosure, it's mandatory if there is a realistic possibility of transmission. And that is the key phrase. 9 judges have told us that realistic possibility of transmission means that if you have a low viral load and you wear a condom, you are not required to disclose if it's vaginal intercourse. That is the only one standard that we actually know in any concrete detail. Everything else is totally made up. And everything else is essentially decided by prejudice. That standard doesn't produce, when you do the math on it, it turns out that that produces an unworkable standard that doesn't actually reflect a realistic possibility of transmission. It's about 1 in, that cutoff is something like 1 in 100,000. If it's just a condom, it's higher, but not statistically different. And so, here's where I really think we go off the rails. We apply fraud to the question of pregnancy, and we ask whether or not pregnancy is a form of serious bodily harm. And this is where I think we get our mistakes really coming to light. There's a case involving a fellow who pierced holes in condoms of his girlfriend, because naturally he was worried that she was going to break up with him, and the only way to keep her is if you could get her pregnant. By the time the case makes it up to the Supreme Court, which I think takes about 8 years in this case, the panel splits, the 9 judges split on 2 ways that they can do it. And the first way is fraud, through this same serious risk of substantial bodily harm calculus, essentially saying that pregnancy is a serious risk. Or sorry, pregnancy presents the risk, a serious risk of substantial bodily harm. The other way is to actually look at the nature and quality of the sexual act, which is another defined way that we limit your consent in the code. In my opinion, that makes a lot more sense to say that protected sex is something fundamentally different than unprotected sex. I'm wrong, the court has told me I'm wrong, and they expressly reject the idea that the sexual activity in question can be conditioned on protection, which produces some really interesting questions for you going forward. And this is really literally where the state of the law is. An individual who has a vasectomy is not obliged to wear a condom that is fully intact. It's nitpicking. It certainly is nitpicking of mine, but it is this idea that the court, through these series of mistakes that have been compounded, have, in essence, removed some of the protection that is afforded to you under the law. That's it.
Would it be possible to move the laptop on the podium?
Pardon?
Would you, oh, you're, or you could.
Would this be okay? If I push it down?
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so thank you, that was really interesting. I'm going to talk about something a little bit more lighthearted and hopefully something kind of fun and entertaining. I definitely thought it was. I'm going to talk about an assertion from medical history that is so ludicrous that it kind of looks like a typing mistake, and it's something that we would definitely today classify as a mistaken claim, one of these missteps in the history of science that don't quite fit into the progression that we like to make for ourselves about it. So we encounter these sorts of things a lot, and if you're thinking about the history of medical science, you'll probably, or history of Western medical science, you'll think of things like bloodletting, leeches, treating syphilis with mercury, Gross. They all sound like tortures rather than actual medical procedures. But if you study these things within their conceptual framework, their paradigm, if you like your Thomas Kuhn, they make a lot of sense, and they're also really useful for exploring some cool aspects of medical history that we might not otherwise come to light. And I'm going to look at this one treatise from which it is possible to reconstruct a really interesting debate in the history of medical thought and concerning what sort of lifestyle you should be living. So, this is the cover page of the treatise. It's got a great name. The Juice of the Grape, or Wine Preferable to Water. A treatise wherein wine is shown to be the great preserver of health and restorer in most diseases, with many instances of cures performed by this noble remedy, and the method of using it, as well as for prevention as cure, with a word of advice to the vintners by a fellow of the college. It's a very Massey title. So the fellow of the college actually wasn't a fellow of Massey. He was a member of the Royal College of Physicians in London. His name is Peter Shaw. And he wrote this treatise in 1724. And this sort of treatise format was very much how medical knowledge was distributed in this era. It was kind of a free-for-all, but if you were a physician, you could write these short little pamphlets if you had a good idea or if you had a good theory, and distribute it. Your peers would read it, and they would respond in kind with their little treatises, either agreeing with or objecting to your claims. So, in order to understand what Shaw is getting at here, it's important to understand that he was contributing to this pretty significant debate in the medical community at the time, and this was a debate about what exactly constituted an ideal lifestyle, and what was the best lifestyle to resist disease and to heal yourself of diseases that you might already have. So, I've heard of the four-humor model of the body. This was common in Western and Islamic science from the time of the ancient Greeks up until the 19th century, so it lasted a very long time. The general idea was that everybody's body was powered by these four different types of fluids. So you have blood, you have yellow bile, phlegm, black bile. There's all kinds of theories as to why those four, they're kind of complicated if you want to know, I can tell you. But those were the four. And each was associated with different qualities. And importantly, each individual had their own balance of these humors. So let's say Fuselius here. We'll assume that he has, in order for Fuselius to be healthy, he needs to have a lot of blood, a little bit less yellow bile, less melancholy, and not very much phlegm at all. And each individual person needed to have, these are all my favorite characters, needed to have a particular balance. And if you mess with that balance, then diseases and sickness and unwellness could result. And so that was one important aspect of maintaining your health. The second aspect was that all of these fluids had to be constantly flowing through your body. You can't have any sort of stagnation. Stagnation was what led to consumptive illnesses. And so constant eating, perspiring, evacuating, purging were essential to maintaining your health. And if there was any sort of stagnation, like maybe you've got a bunch of black bile there, then that would spread and corrupt your whole body. It's like a rotting apple that eventually becomes completely rotted after one bruise. So, in the early part of the 18th century, there was this camp of physicians that saw the upper class living this lifestyle of overconsumption, lots of meat, lots of alcohol, lots of sweets. And they thought that this made it impossible for the body to keep up with this internal flux. You're taking in too much, you're not putting out enough because your body can't keep up, and therefore you've got these sort of putrefactions happening in your body, and all these illnesses as a result. So this guy, George Shane, was one of the more famous proponents of this side of the argument. He suggested that this was like both a moral vice and a health vice, all this overconsumption, and that in order to solve all these health problems that people were getting, gout, smallpox, leprosy, dropsy, cancer, the solution was to be as abstemious and simple in your diet as possible. Vegetarianism was encouraged, sweets and alcohol were to be avoided, and of course this was also tied up in the language of virtue. Still at this point a very Christian society, all the saints were fasting, etc. However, if there's anything that's certain about health advice, it's that there's always people who will take it to the extreme. And evidently there were some physicians who were, after George Shane published his popular treatise, some were horrified to see how people became abstemious to the point of self-destruction. So thinness and pallor and weakness became very fashionable, especially for the upper class. And this guy was from the latter half of the 18th century, by the point where this trend had become more established. But he complained about how the upper class were allowing their children, particularly their daughters, to become extremely picky eaters in pursuit of this very thin, very pale, weak, delicate ideal. They didn't really have any concept of an eating disorder back then, but I think that's probably what's going on in a lot of cases. And romanticizing consumption, this is not a modern phenomenon, because it was an illness that made its victims so fetchingly pale and thin, wasting away. And it also became fashionable to have lots of illnesses that you needed to constantly treat with medicine. So it was kind of like a point of pride that you had to take 12 medicines a day because it was so delicate. So Beddoes was suggesting we need to look to the active medieval farmers and see they ate lots of meat, they were very active, and we need to encourage this sort of vigor and vivaciousness in our kids and in ourselves. So this is a cartoon from the turn of the 19th century. It's called Dropsy, which is another old-fashioned name for edema, courting consumption. So they've got this very thin, wasting away woman and this extremely corpulent man. And you can see they're courting each other on the steps of a mausoleum.
Oh.
Yeah. So in light of that, let's get back to this pro-wine treatise. So this was actually written in the same year as Shane wrote his pro-vegetarianism abstention treatise. So it's pretty clear that this debate was going on even in the early part of the 18th century. So believe it or not, Shaw, the writer of this, he presented wine as the solution to both the problems that were suffered by the two characters in the previous slide. I couldn't find any evidence that he owned shares or anything in vineyards, but from the sound of the treatise, it sounded like he did. He thought it cured everything. So this was his treatise was actually written as a response to another one. It was written by a certain Dr. Hancock. It was titled Febrifuga Magnum, Common Water, the Best Cure for Fevers and Probably for the Plague. And Shaw's thesis basically was the opposite of this. He thought water cured everything. Shaw thought that wine cured everything. So Shaw's thesis is that no, wine is the best cure for both of these things, and he doesn't include the word probably in the title. So Shaw criticizes people who are weak and who rely on too many medications. He says that 'tis an opinion as old as medicine itself and as well founded too, that the Creator intended us no other physic than our food. Nature, says Pliny, meant no other remedies but those simple, vulgar ones we live on. So he thought that your diet should be your medicine, but that wine should be a significant part of that diet. And here's why. He believed that the medicinal virtues of the soil and of the grapes and how vivacious the vines are, I don't know what that means exactly, but something about these qualities in the earth and in the sun and in the grapes were all very healthful. And then as wine was made, it was sort of concentrated, the fermentation activated these like vital spirits, and as a result you get this like perfect health tonic. He says, 'tis a light, clean, beautiful fluid of a fragrant scent and delicious flavor, easy of digestion, and the most homogeneous to the human body of all vegetable productions. And unlike food, wine didn't come, according to him anyway, with any excess matter that would need to be necessarily purged from the body, because everything had already been distilled out of it. So, as a result, this guy could have a glass of wine because it would enliven him and it would speed up the flow of his blood without actually contributing to his excess. And for anyone suffering diseases of overconsumption, he has dozens and dozens of accounts where he claims to have cured people from lots of diseases just by using different types of wine. To those suffering from diseases of weakness, or what we would call mental illnesses like distemper and hysteria, and he says the vital properties of the wine would enliven these people, so she could have a glass of wine too. He wrote of a case where he oversaw some hysterical ladies who were extremely thin and emaciated, low in spirits, and of an ill habit of body were made strong, florid, and healthy by the same means. So she could have some as well. For him, water, by contrast, is not bad per se, but it lacks the healing properties. So there's that quote that I just read off. Water, on the other hand, is a raw, crude, tasteless, scentless fluid that manifests no virtues to any of our senses. Wine is a well-concocted and putrefied juice, grateful to the smell and charming to the taste. And he also compares the body to a machine, which was actually an important development in early modern medicine, the mechanization of the body, turning it from this sort of flux of flowing fluids to a machine that had different pumps and levers and things like that. So when he compares wine to water in terms of putting something into the machine, he says that water serves chiefly to dilute, as it were, or to oil the wheels of the machine, whilst wine has not only the same or superior advantages in this respect, but also adds a moment and pondus to the moving machine, and supplies matter to begin, continue, and renew the motion. So wine sped up the motion, that flux that was necessary to keep you healthy, and it imbued you with the sort of vital spirit that would keep you enlivened. And in this way, because this flux was so critical for any disease, or that you need to be cured of, or preventing any disease, wine was good for all cases. So wine is in most cases infinitely preferable to water. So mostly I just wanted to talk about this fun treatise, but I think it's interesting to see how this gross, crazy mistake in medicine is actually super interesting, and we can learn a lot from it, and we can learn a lot about the context of the time, and have lots of fun doing it, I guess.
Hi everyone, I'm and I'm going to be presenting on the subject, is the responsibility to protect a mistake? So just a little bit about me. I'm a JD student at the U of T Faculty of Law, just started at Massey, and I also work for a group at U of T called the Canadian Center for the Responsibility to Protect that may or may not give you an idea as to how I'm going to try to answer this question. But I think it's an important question because our two-piece 10th anniversary is this year. It was adopted by the UN in 2005. But what we see on the news is the terrible conflict in Syria, more than 4 years of civil war, crimes committed by all sides, refugees willing to risk death to escape from this conflict. And it's clearly a conflict that the international community has manifestly failed to stop. At the recent United Nations dialogue on the responsibility to protect that happened just last week, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, said that we failed vulnerable populations too many times and that history's judgment on the international failure to act in Syria would be harsh. So in this presentation, I'm going to consider 3 of the specific arguments as to why the responsibility to protect is a mistake. The first is militarism, the second is that it's a mask for selfish state interests, and the third is that it's failed to galvanize action. I will explain why I think these arguments are misguided, and I will end by reaffirming why the failures of states to implement R2P actually underscore the need to apply political commitment and resources to implement it. So, what is the responsibility to protect? R2P is a humanitarian principle that was coined in 2001 and agreed to by the United Nations at the 2005 World Summit. And it essentially holds that when sovereign states are unwilling to protect their own populations from mass atrocity crimes, the international community has a responsibility to exercise that protection. Now, where did R2P come from? Largely, it's a product of the post-Cold War era. After the end of the Cold War, there were a number of civil wars, ethnic conflicts in different parts of the world, and this prevented the international community with a dilemma. Many of you are familiar with the Rwandan genocide, and as Romeo Dallaire has described very eloquently in his writings on this subject, when the international community decided not to intervene and to do nothing, 800,000 people were killed in a matter of weeks. On the other hand, in 1999, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization decided to attack the country of Yugoslavia without the consent of the UN Security Council in order to protect the people of Kosovo and their human rights. This caused many critics to assume that protecting people in peril through humanitarian intervention threatened the structure of international law and the rules that should govern international relations. So this was a real dilemma. It was a dilemma that was noted by the UN Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan. And it was a challenge that Canada decided to take up by launching the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty. This commission produced its report in 2001 that proposed R2P, the responsibility to protect, as a new way forward to get out of this dilemma. So the first thing R2P did is that it changed the conceptual language from talking about the right of powerful states to intervene in conflicts when they wanted to a shared responsibility belonging to the whole international community to protect people from mass atrocities. It put the responsibility first on the authorities of each state to protect their own people, and then on the international community to assist and to protect when states were unable or unwilling to do so. And R2P really changed a lot of the discourse surrounding sovereignty. It moved away from the idea of seeing sovereignty as an absolute right that each state was entitled to, and shifted that to seeing sovereignty as a responsibility that was owed to the people of a state to provide them protection and to the international community. So R2P was actually adopted by the UN in fairly short order, only 4 years after it was first proposed. This happened at the 2005 World Summit, a meeting of 150 heads of government throughout the world. And at the World Summit, member states agreed that R2P applies to 4 specific crimes. These are war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. The summit reaffirmed that each state has a responsibility to protect its own people from these crimes. It said that the international community has a responsibility to assist states to meet their protection obligations. And it said that when states fail to protect their own people, the international community could exercise timely and decisive action, including the possibility of military force when authorized by the United Nations Security Council. In 2009, the new UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon outlined the 3-pillar approach to R2P. The first pillar is that each state bears responsibility to protect its own people. The second pillar is the international duty to assist states to meet their responsibilities. And the third pillar is the duty of the international community to respond timely and decisively when mass atrocity crimes are occurring. So I'm going to tackle the first argument first, and this is the charge of militarism. Basically, this line of criticism argues that R2P rushes to use military measures in response to mass atrocity crimes, this only ends up destabilizing societies, leading to conflict and violence that harms the very people that intervention was meant to protect. And this line of argument has really been fueled by the consequences of Western interventions in places like Afghanistan and Iraq that all of you are familiar with. But the main problem with this line of criticism is that it's a basic misunderstanding of R2P. As I mentioned before, R2P isn't about a right of military intervention, but about a shared responsibility to protect people in peril. And this begins not with military force, but with each state's duty to protect its own people and the international community's duty to assist states in meeting this. And this is prevention, this is not actually intervention. Only in Pillar 3, timely and decisive response, do you start to consider measures that a state does not agree to. But even most of these measures are actually peaceful. There's a wide range of peaceful measures you can use, ranging from arms embargoes, sanctions, the International Criminal Court, to preventive diplomacy and mediation. Only if these have failed or have been judged likely to fail is it permissible to try to use force. And even then, there's a fairly demanding test. It has to be approved by the United Nations Security Council, an organization that has 5 great powers, each of which can veto any action. So this is a truly demanding test. So far from rushing impetuously to use force, R2P prioritizes peaceful prevention, privileges non-military tools of response, and sees military intervention as a last resort that's subject to a strict test of authorization. Now the second line of criticism about R2P is essentially that it's a Trojan horse, that it's used as window dressing to camouflage the selfless ambitions of the states that invoke it. States use it to justify their interests, and when their interests are not at stake in a conflict, they simply don't apply R2P. The first point I'm going to make is that the Trojan horse accusation of states using R2P as a cloak for their selfish ambitions has been discredited by events. No, the only state that has invoked R2P to attack another country without the authorization of the Security Council is not actually a Western country, it is Russia. Russia did this twice, once in 2008 when it attacked Georgia,